When the world questions what love should look like, believers must return to the one who designed it. Beyond the noise of human opinions lies a divine design, one that does not ask what is easier, but what is wiser, purer, and closer to God. In a world that debates between polygamy and celibacy, between desire and denial, between what feels right and what is divinely right, we often forget to ask the most important question: what aligns with the wisdom of God? When we speak about relationships, it is not merely a social discussion. It is a sacred conversation about purpose. Human connections are not accidental. They are designed to nurture the heart, discipline the soul, and draw us nearer to the Creator. Both polygamy and celibacy are paths, and like all paths in this life, they lead either toward God or away from Him, depending on our intentions and our submission to divine principles. Polygamy, in its true essence, is not a pursuit of pleasure, but a test of justice, mercy, and humility. It was permitted not as a reward for men, but as a responsibility before God, one that demands fairness, compassion, and restraint. When practiced under divine boundaries, it becomes a solution to social and moral challenges, offering protection, dignity, and balance in societies where imbalance threatens the vulnerable. Yet, when stripped of its sacred intention, it becomes oppression, not because God designed it so, but because humanity distorted it. God's law is perfect. It is our hearts that often fall short of it. The command for justice among spouses is so stern that the Quran warns, "You will never be able to be completely just between wives, even if you desire." That reminder is not a discouragement, but a call for self-awareness, that even in obedience, humility must remain. On the other hand, celibacy is not an escape from responsibility, nor is it a sign of spiritual superiority. It becomes noble only when it is chosen for the sake of devotion, when one distances from marriage not out of fear or failure, but out of focus on worship, on serving humanity, on transcending the self. The prophet of God did not command celibacy. Rather, he warned against it as a permanent state, reminding us that marriage completes half of faith. Yet, in certain circumstances, when the heart seeks solitude for purification, when life demands full dedication to a cause, celibacy can become a form of quiet worship, a way of turning the energy of desire into devotion. But again, it is the intention that sanctifies the act, not the act itself. God's plan does not restrict the soul, it refines it. His laws are not meant to suppress our humanity, but to align it with divinity. In both polygamy and celibacy, the believer's challenge is not which path to choose, but how to walk either path with sincerity, justice, and awareness. We live in a time where personal freedom is worshipped, yet spiritual discipline is forgotten. People ask, "What do I want?" instead of, "What does God want for me?" The true believer, however, reverses the question. They ask not for the easiest path, but for the most purposeful one, not for what pleases people, but for what pleases the Creator. So when you think of polygamy, do not think of privilege, think of responsibility. When you think of celibacy, do not think of loneliness, think of devotion. Both are opportunities to worship, one through service to others, the other through solitude with God. The beauty of divine wisdom is that it does not demand uniformity. It honors diversity in human circumstances. For one person, marriage is a means to spiritual completion. For another, celibacy becomes a means of spiritual elevation. What matters is not what the world praises or condemns. What matters is what brings your soul into alignment with God's light. Therefore, let us rise above the arguments of the world and listen to the whispers of divine truth. Every law in faith carries mercy at its core. Whether you choose to walk the path of companionship or solitude, let your intention be pure, your heart be just, and your purpose be sacred. For at the end of every human journey, the question will not be whether you were married or celibate. The question will be, did your choice bring you closer to the one who created love, designed desire, and taught your soul how to return to Him in peace? In a world overflowing with debates, judgments, and conflicting interpretations, the question of whether polygamy or celibacy aligns more closely with God's plan invites us into a deeper exploration of divine wisdom rather than human emotion. It is not simply a social topic or a moral argument. It is a question that touches the very foundation of human purpose and spiritual design. When we reflect upon life, relationships, and the choices we make, we must recognize that God's commands are never arbitrary. They are rooted in balance, mercy, and justice. Polygamy and celibacy are not competing lifestyles. They are paths through which souls may journey toward God, depending on their circumstances, intentions, and inner strength. To understand which path aligns with divine purpose, we must first remove the veil of worldly perception that often clouds spiritual clarity. Society today views marriage as a personal preference and celibacy as an unusual choice, but faith teaches us that neither is about self-centered desire. Both are about service to God, to self, and to others. Polygamy in its divine context is not a license for indulgence, but a test of justice, fairness, and emotional discipline. It is a command that carries weight, responsibility, and deep accountability before God. It was never meant to serve ego or lust. Rather, it exists as a divine solution for social and moral imbalance, a way to preserve dignity and provide security for those who might otherwise be left vulnerable. Yet, throughout history, humanity has often misused it, forgetting that what God permits for mercy becomes corruption when driven by selfishness. Polygamy is not about superiority of one gender over another. It is about divine wisdom addressing real human needs, ensuring that compassion and protection prevail where chaos could otherwise dominate. When practiced with sincerity, justice, and mercy, it mirrors the balance God intended for society. However, the moment it is stripped of its moral foundation, it loses its essence and becomes a shadow of its true purpose. God's law remains pure, only human interpretation can stain it. On the other hand, celibacy, though not an obligation in Islam, can be a sacred act when chosen with the right intention. It represents a different form of surrender, one that demands self-control, spiritual focus, and detachment from worldly attachments. But celibacy is not an escape from responsibility. It is not a rejection of love or human connection. It is a redirection of that energy toward divine love and higher purpose. The one who chooses celibacy for the sake of God's pleasure does not despise marriage. Rather, they acknowledge that their heart for a time or perhaps a lifetime is meant to serve God in a different way. The Prophet himself discouraged forced celibacy, reminding believers that marriage completes half of faith. But he also respected those who, for reasons of devotion, circumstance, or service, remained unmarried without falling into sin. This balance reveals God's mercy. He does not burden one's soul with a single rule that fits all. He gives freedom within faith. Knowing that his creation is diverse in capacity, emotion, and calling, celibacy becomes beautiful when it refines the soul, when it teaches patience, contentment, and spiritual depth. But when it is chosen out of fear, pride, or rejection of divine design, it loses its sanctity. Just like marriage, it must be guided by sincerity, by social rebellion or emotional withdrawal. Both paths, marriage and celibacy, are means not ends. They are vehicles for spiritual growth, each carrying its own trials and rewards. In polygamy, one must struggle against injustice, jealousy, and the temptations of ego. In celibacy, one must struggle against loneliness, desire, and the whispers of self-pity. Neither is superior in itself. What makes one higher in the sight of God is the intention behind it. A married person may be drowning in sin, while an unmarried person may rise in worship. And the opposite can also be true. God looks not at our status, but at our sincerity, not at our number of relationships, but at our number of sacrifices. The question, which aligns with God's plan, cannot be answered by labeling one right and the other wrong. God's plan is vast, layered with wisdom, and accommodates both choices when pursued for righteousness. What truly aligns with his plan is justice, mercy, and purity of intention. If one practices polygamy with fairness, care, and compassion, that is worship. If one practices celibacy with patience, gratitude, and devotion, that too is worship. Both paths require discipline. Both demand surrender. When we surrender to God's wisdom, we learn that his laws are not meant to suppress, but to shape. They are designed not to confine our freedom, but to align it with purpose. Modern minds often question the fairness of divine rulings, comparing them to cultural ideals. God's justice transcends emotion. It rests on knowledge beyond our comprehension. Human understanding is limited by time, desire, and ego, but divine wisdom is eternal. The one who trusts in God's decree finds peace, whether they live in companionship or solitude. The one who doubts his wisdom remains restless, even when surrounded by love. True faith is not about finding what pleases us. It is about discovering what pleases him. So, whether a believer chooses marriage or celibacy, monogamy or polygamy, what matters is not the external form, but the internal alignment with divine guidance. The path that draws the heart closer to God, that refines the soul and humbles the ego, that teaches justice, mercy, and love, that is the path that truly aligns with his plan. Therefore, before questioning which is better, we must ask ourselves, what do I seek from this choice, comfort or closeness to God? Every act of obedience must begin with intention. Polygamy without justice is oppression, and celibacy without devotion is emptiness. But when both are pursued with awareness of God, they become acts of worship that purify the heart and illuminate the soul. God does not measure us by our marital status, but by our spiritual state. His plan is not one size fits all. It is tailored to each soul's journey. To some, he grants the test of companionship. To others, the test of solitude. Each carries lessons of patience, gratitude, and surrender. When you accept that, peace begins to bloom inside you. The world may continue debating, labeling, and comparing, but the believer walks quietly, knowing that the purpose of life is not to please people, but to fulfill the sacred trust placed by God. In the end, neither polygamy nor celibacy is the destination. They are both roads leading to the same divine truth that our hearts were never meant to belong entirely to this world, to the one who created them. When we examine the question of polygamy and celibacy in light of divine wisdom, we must rise above the shallow interpretations that often dominate human thought and approach the matter through the lens of faith, sincerity, and purpose. Both paths, whether sharing life with multiple spouses or dedicating oneself entirely to solitude, carry spiritual dimensions that reveal the depth of God's mercy and the complexity of his creation. Polygamy, when viewed through divine guidance rather than social distortion, is as a system built upon justice and compassion. It was never intended to promote desire or male privilege, but to address human realities that arise within communities, realities such as widows, orphans, imbalance between genders, and emotional or social needs. It functions as a safeguard against immorality and a source of care for those who may otherwise be neglected. The wisdom behind its allowance lies in its intention to protect human dignity and provide harmony in society. However, this sacred permission comes with an equally sacred warning: absolute justice must prevail. God's words remind believers that even if they strive, perfect equality in emotion and affection is beyond human reach, but fairness in responsibility, provision, and respect remains obligatory. Polygamy becomes a form of worship when carried out with humility, sincerity, and awareness of accountability before God, but when practiced for ego, control, or pleasure, it turns into transgression. Therefore, understanding its purpose requires understanding divine justice, the principle that every command of God carries not just permission but responsibility. True polygamy is not a conquest of desire, it is a conquest over self. It teaches patience, compassion, and balance. It tests one's ability to love without injustice and to lead without arrogance. It is a path that only aligns with God's plan when the heart of the person walking it is purified from pride and rooted in mercy. In contrast, celibacy unfolds as a different kind of spiritual journey, one not built on outward companionship, but on inward devotion. While marriage is a recommended sunnah and a completion of faith, celibacy, when chosen for sincere reasons, can be a sacred act of discipline and worship. It is not about rejecting human love, but about elevating it to a higher form where the longing of the heart is redirected toward divine closeness. There have been individuals throughout history whose missions required them to remain unmarried, not because they denied the beauty of companionship, but because their calling demanded full dedication to service, worship, or the spread of knowledge. Their solitude became their form of devotion, and their restraint became their act of love. Celibacy is not a command, but an allowance, meant for those whose hearts find peace in seclusion with God rather than in the warmth of marriage. However, it loses its sanctity when motivated by arrogance, fear, or avoidance of responsibility. True celibacy is not escape, it is elevation. It requires as much strength as marriage does, for it demands mastery over one's desires and control over one's emotions. Both paths are trials, both are blessings, both can become means to spiritual growth if navigated with sincerity. The heart that chooses either must remain conscious of God's presence, for it is not the outward condition that determines righteousness, but the inward intention that sanctifies it. God's plan does not favor one over the other universally. It honors both when pursued in alignment with His will. He knows the nature of every soul, the depth of every heart, and the circumstances of every life. For one, polygamy may be the road to justice, mercy, and compassion. For another, celibacy may be the road to purity, focus, and devotion. What binds them together is the thread of obedience, the willingness to surrender personal preference to divine wisdom. In the end, both are not merely choices of lifestyle, but expressions of faith. The question is not which path is better, but which path brings one closer to the Creator. When one's intention is purified and every step is guided by remembrance of God, whether one lives in companionship or solitude, they are walking in the light of His plan, fulfilling the purpose for which the heart was created, to know love and return to Him. When we explore the delicate question of whether polygamy or celibacy aligns more closely with God's plan, we must begin by understanding that divine wisdom does not conform to human comfort, but to divine justice, mercy, and spiritual purpose. God, in His infinite knowledge, designed human life with diversity, different circumstances, desires, and strengths, so that no single path could define righteousness for all. Polygamy, for instance, is not a command but a divine permission, a moral framework established not for indulgence but for compassion. It acknowledges the social and emotional complexities of life, offering a system that safeguards dignity, particularly for women and children in times when imbalance or crisis occurs. It provides a means of stability where chaos might otherwise prevail. Yet this allowance is not without boundaries. It is surrounded by divine warnings that emphasize fairness, equality, and justice. For these are the pillars of any relationship that seeks God's pleasure. To engage in polygamy without fulfilling these conditions is to betray its spiritual foundation. It is a system that tests the moral integrity of the individual, demanding patience, self-restraint, and emotional intelligence. It requires not just material provision, but emotional fairness, a balance that only the conscious heart can maintain. The prophet was permitted multiple marriages, not as a model for pleasure, but as a lesson in responsibility, justice, and mercy. His life demonstrated that love, when guided by faith, is not selfish but sacrificial, impulsive but intentional. Thus, polygamy, in its pure essence, is not about numbers. It is about nurturing responsibility and discipline under divine command. On the other hand, celibacy carries its own spiritual significance, though often misunderstood in both religious and secular contexts. It is not about rejecting the natural inclination to love or connect, but about redirecting that love towards something higher, toward the divine. Celibacy becomes meaningful when chosen not out of fear of attachment or rejection of worldly ties, but out of deep devotion and purposeful focus. There are souls whom God chooses for solitude, granting them hearts that find peace in worship and service rather than in companionship. Such people dedicate their lives to prayer, reflection, teaching, or service, and in their solitude, they cultivate a love so deep that it transcends physical companionship. Their celibacy becomes an act of worship, a sacred vow between them and their Creator, reflecting a higher form of spiritual intimacy. But celibacy is not for everyone, for it demands great strength and self-discipline. It requires mastery over the self, forgoing worldly desires not out of disdain for them, because one's mission or calling demands undivided devotion. When practiced without arrogance or self-praise, it becomes a pure form of surrender. However, if celibacy is chosen to escape responsibility or out of disdain for divine law, it loses its sanctity. In the same way, if marriage or polygamy is pursued for selfish gratification, it loses its sacred essence. The core of righteousness lies not in what we choose, but in why we choose it. Both paths, celibacy and marriage, can either elevate or destroy a soul, depending on intention. A sincere celibate may find God in solitude, while a just spouse may find Him through care and companionship. Each journey demands awareness, humility, and faith, for without these, both paths become empty shells of spiritual truth. Ultimately, God's plan is not limited to one form of human relationship. It is reflected in balance, justice, and sincerity across all circumstances. He did not create one rule for all hearts, but allowed diversity so that each person could find Him through their unique test. For some, companionship becomes a mirror that reveals their flaws and teaches patience, forgiveness, and love. For others, solitude becomes a mirror that exposes their inner struggles, refining their devotion and deepening their dependence on God. The purpose of both polygamy and celibacy is not to divide believers into categories of greater or lesser holiness, but to provide paths through which each can attain spiritual maturity. God's laws are not meant to restrict. They are meant to guide humanity toward harmony within themselves and their Creator. Whether one serves God through nurturing a family or through silent worship, both serve the same Lord, both walk toward the same eternal home. What aligns with God's plan is not the title one holds, spouse or celibate, but the purity of intention, the sincerity of worship, and the effort to live in harmony with divine wisdom. The believer's question, therefore, should not be which is right, but which brings me closer to God. When the answer to that question is pursued with humility and faith, every path becomes sacred, and every choice becomes an act of worship. For in the end, it is not our status that matters, but the state of our heart when it meets the one who created love, desire, and purpose, not to enslave us to them, but to guide us through them back to Him. When we look at the question of whether polygamy or celibacy aligns with God's plan, We must understand that divine wisdom is far greater than human understanding, and God's laws are not designed to serve desires, but to guide the soul toward justice, mercy, and balance. The choices that humans make regarding companionship or solitude are not matters of superiority, but reflections of divine purpose within individual lives. Polygamy, often misunderstood in the modern world, was never meant to be a means of pleasure or pride. It was revealed as a merciful system that addresses real human and social needs. It provides protection for those left vulnerable, offers justice where imbalance exists, and ensures moral stability where immorality might otherwise take root. God allowed it within clear boundaries, knowing the challenges of human nature and society. It is not a law for domination, but for compassion. It was revealed not to favor one gender, but to uphold fairness in times of need. Yet, it is a path only for those strong enough to bear its weight, for it demands patience, justice, emotional intelligence, and self-restraint. The divine condition is clear. If one cannot uphold equality and justice, then monogamy is safer and purer. Thus, polygamy becomes a test of the soul's discipline, not a license for indulgence. It asks whether the heart can balance love and fairness, desire and duty, emotion and ethics. When done with sincerity and accountability before God, it reflects the mercy within divine law. But when driven by pride, lust, or ego, it transforms into oppression, something far removed from the purpose God intended. In contrast, celibacy stands as another form of divine wisdom, one not based on social structure, but on spiritual devotion. It is not obligatory, yet when chosen for sincere reasons, it can become a path of purity and inner peace. Celibacy, when pursued for God's sake, demands immense spiritual strength, for it requires control over human desires and emotional dependence. It is a life of sacrifice that channels love and longing toward the divine rather than the creation. However, celibacy is not to be confused with isolation or rejection of God's natural order. Rather, it is a redirection of human energy toward worship, knowledge, and service. Throughout history, there have been men and women whose missions required solitude, those who dedicated every heartbeat to spiritual causes, whose focus and commitment could not be divided. Their celibacy was not a denial of life, but a deeper embrace of it through devotion. Yet, God never commanded celibacy for all, for He created humans with needs, emotions, and desires that can be fulfilled through lawful companionship. Therefore, celibacy becomes an honorable choice only when it arises from devotion, not fear, from purpose, not pride, and from understanding, not rebellion. It is a journey that purifies the self and teaches surrender, but it is not for all souls. Those who walk it must do so with humility, knowing that it is a trust and a test, just as marriage is. When practiced with awareness of God, it brings the heart closer to divine peace. When practiced with self-centered intent, it becomes a path of loneliness and imbalance. The truth is that both paths, polygamy and celibacy, are rooted in the same divine principle, the alignment of the human will with God's will. God did not make one path inherently superior to the other. He made both avenues for worship, sacrifice, and self-purification. The key lies in intention. What differentiates righteousness from misguidance is not the outer act, but the inner purpose. A person who practices polygamy with compassion, fairness, and justice is closer to God than one who practices it for ego or dominance. Similarly, one who lives in celibacy with sincerity and devotion is beloved to God, while one who does so out of arrogance or avoidance of duty falls into error. Divine law never limits humanity, it guides it toward balance. God knows that His creation is diverse, and therefore He provides multiple paths for spiritual fulfillment. One person may find faith through nurturing a family and raising children in righteousness, while another may find it through solitude, reflection, and service. Both are walking toward the same destination, the pleasure of God. The question is not which path we choose, but whether our choice draws us nearer to Him. Every command of God, every allowance carries a lesson about the human soul, its capacity for love, its potential for restraint, and its duty to reflect divine justice in every action. In the end, what aligns with God's plan is not measured by outward form, but by inward sincerity. The true alignment with God's will is achieved when the heart acts not out of desire, fear, or social expectation, out of conscious obedience and trust in divine wisdom. Whether one is married or unmarried, living with a partner, or walking alone, the real test is the same. Can the heart remain pure, just and devoted to its creator? Polygamy teaches fairness, patience, and humility. Celibacy teaches self-control, focus, and detachment from worldly distractions. Both paths have challenges that shape the soul and bring it closer to spiritual maturity. Pleases God is not the label of one's status, but the purity of one's heart within it. A person who uses their position, whether as a spouse or a servant in solitude. To cultivate love, kindness, and justice fulfills God's plan more deeply than one who outwardly follows a law but inwardly disobeys it. The believer understands that this world is a field of tests, and each path, whether through companionship or solitude, carries its own weight. True peace comes not from comparing choices, but from surrendering completely to God's wisdom and finding contentment in His decree. For the one who walks in awareness of His presence, every step, whether toward family or toward solitude, becomes worship, and every breath becomes a testimony that all paths, when walked in sincerity, lead back to the same divine destination, the nearness of God, the purpose of life, and the fulfillment of His eternal plan.